So I will present a little version of a longer article which is already available on my website. So if you go to hanshoppe.com, it has been published today, so you can read all of this and far more than what I'm going to present here. The article was written as a chapter for a book that was initiated by Tom DiLorenzo on war and revisionist views of war. And to describe roughly what my topic is, so all states are the result of wars, and states are always inclined to go to war, but typically a differentiation is made for two ideal types of war. On the one hand, we have monarchical wars, and on the other hand, we have democratic wars. Monarchical wars are typically wars concerning some territories. They are not ideological wars, it's just wars, I want this, I think this belongs to me instead of belonging to you. Democratic wars, on the other hand, are wars where the entire population is involved. The monarchical war is a war that only concerns the monarch himself. He does it with his own resources and so forth. Ideological motives play normally very little role, if any. Democratic wars, on the other hand, are wars that the entire population is involved in the war. They are usually ideologically motivated, and at the end of the war, if one party wins, the other party loses, because it was an ideological war involving the entire population. The punishment is usually a collective form of punishment, whereas the monarchical wars frequently end in no other way than simply the landlord changed, so to speak, without having any major effect on the rest of the population. The change from monarchical wars to democratic wars occurred basically with the French Revolution. Since the French Revolution, most wars have been democratic wars, and the losing party in these wars has to receive some sort of collective punishment as bad people who were on the wrong side. The last monarchical peace took place after the Napoleonic Wars and was conducted at the Vienna Congress in 1814-15. So after Napoleon was defeated by the Russian Tsar, the Prussian king, and the British king and the Habsburgs, the conclusion of that war was simply that France was restored to the borders of 1789, just as before the Napoleonic War started. Napoleon was sent into exile. The Bourbons were restored to the throne. A little bit of compensation had to be paid, and at the peace treaties, Talleyrand, the representative of France, actively was allowed to participate in what the conditions, what the terms of the war were. Now I want to show that these types of arrangements, like they did after the Vienna Congress, which then created a period of almost 100 years of peace because it was not a revenge that they took at France. As a matter of fact, they restored France to what it was before. That this type of peace treatment is completely unusual since that time. And I want to show what democratic peaces looked like afterwards and choose Germany as an example. World War I and World War II. I'm not so much interested in all of this. Again, keep in mind, I'm not so much interested in what causes the war and in the conduct of war, but just at the end of the war. How did they end the war? And show that democratic peace is, so to speak, always a revengeful peace. World War I began as a monarchical war. The contending parties basically had territorial interests, conflicting territorial interests, but it ended as a democratic war and as a revenge war, ending with revenge against the losers. That happened for two reasons. On the one hand, the United States entered the war at the very end, and the Russian Tsar had to abdicate and was eventually killed. If you look at the cost of the war, there were 20 million dead, 20 million were wounded. The peace that was offered to the losing side, that is Germany and Austria-Hungary, essentially, and also Turkey on their side, whereas on the other side you had Britain, the United States, and France. Initially, it sounded like it was a peace that was not an unconditional surrender by the Germans. Wilson, the president of the United States, had his 14 points where he promised there will be no revenge taken, there will be no territorial demands and all of this. And Lloyd George, the Prime Minister of England at the time, said similar things. On these conditions, the Germans surrendered, but as soon as they surrendered, they changed immediately this promise. It will not be an unconditional surrender, but we will treat you like gentlemen. The Germans, the three people who decided on the peace were Wilson, President of the United States. Mencken described him at some point that he thought of himself as the first candidate for the vacancy of the Trinity, and the other people like Clemenceau and Lloyd George thought that he thought of himself as some sort of Jesus. Lloyd George was described by the other participants in the peace negotiations as a would-be Napoleon, and Clemenceau was noted for the fact that above everything else he hated the Germans. So what did they decide? First of all, in the peace negotiations, the losing side was not even invited to the conference. In contrast to Talleyrand playing an important role at the Vienna Congress. The losing side was simply invited to sign whatever they had come up with without anything to say. What they decided was Germany was the sole guilty part in the war. It lost 13% of its territory, or that accounts to about 7 million German people. Germany was demilitarized, heavy reparations were imposed, which quickly led to hyperinflationary conditions in Germany and the default of Germany to pay these reparation demands. Hungary was, for instance, stripped of 70% of its territory and lost 3 million people to other countries. Austria was reduced to 2/3 of the German population and of the former territory, and 3 million people were given to other countries like the newly founded Czechoslovakia and places of that sort. In the case of Turkey, was also on the side of the Axis powers. Turkey was, of course, stripped of all of its Arab provinces that they had. But there's an interesting story too, that Turkey was the only country that then resisted the invasion of Greece that was encouraged by the British to take place. Because of that, Ataturk still occupies a very important role in the Turkish history as the only one who actually just beat these people. In terms of other changes, all borders in Europe were redrawn as a result of these peace treaties. Almost always in violation of the principle that Wilson promoted of self-determination. Czechoslovakia, for instance, the Germans in Czechoslovakia was the second largest group in Czechoslovakia. There were more Germans in Czechoslovakia than there were Slovaks in Czechoslovakia. So no self-determination whatsoever. And many of the conflicts that you have to this day result from this redrawing of borders in Europe, neglecting at the same time the principle of self-determination. The monarchists were thrown out. The Austrian emperor and the German emperor and also the Sultan in Turkey had to abdicate, and as a result of the abdication of the monarchical class, monarchical rulers, democratic and republican rulers were swept to power. All kings, all princes, all dukes, all archdukes and so forth had to give up their privileges, their sovereign rights. Many of them were stripped of large parts of their property. Some private property was left over to them. One example, for instance, was also titles were no longer allowed to be used in Austria, for instance. So Ludwig von Mises became only Ludwig Mises after World War I, and Otto von Habsburg, who would have become the emperor, was simply Otto Habsburg. In Germany, they were allowed to keep the titles, but they lost major amounts of property. The Republicans that came to power were mostly lefties. Democracy automatically brings lefty parties to power. The most important party was the Social Democrats for most of the time of the Weimar Republic. Almost until the end of the Weimar Republic, they were the strongest party. And there was also a very important communist party. Together, the Social Democratic Party and the Communist Party, until the end of the Weimar Republic, combined gained roughly 35% of the vote. And the so-called bourgeois parties that were not committed to Marxist goals also moved increasingly to the left. And they moved increasingly, all parties moved increasingly into a nationalistic direction, because after all of Germany had been seriously punished, so they became more nationalistic. So there was a tendency then over the years that a leftward shift in all of the parties took place, plus a revanchistic, nationalistic tendency. The result of that was, in 1932, for instance, that was the first time the National Socialist German Workers' Party, it should be always made clear that we always use the word Nazis, but the term is, of course, Nationalsozialistische Deutsche Arbeiterpartei. The Nazis did not play a great role until 1932, but 1932 they became the second strongest party with 37% of the vote. That was a time of the Great Depression, the Weltwirtschaftskrise, and the communists at that point gained about close to 15%. All governments before had been some sort of coalition governments. With this constellation, the Nazis with 37% and the communists with near almost 15%, it became impossible to form any coalition without that did not include either the National Socialist Party or the Communist Party. And when it came to this situation, that is, either the Nazis, the National Socialists have to be part of the government, or the communists have to become part of the government, then the population, the decision of the population was quite clear. They all preferred, of course, that the National Socialists should be part of that, and the communists should be excluded, because at that time, people already knew what was going on in the Soviet Union, for instance, and it was perfectly clear that in that case, we prefer National Socialists over the international socialists. I'll come back to this point. I think that is still the case, that wherever this dilemma appears, would you rather have a national socialist government or an internationalist socialist government? The general population, wherever you look, is in favor of a national socialist government. You don't want to share all your property with the entire world. It is bad enough that you have to share it with anyone, and then you prefer only to share it with your own folks rather than sharing it with the entire world. So the Nazis, National Socialists, became then the strongest party, and they quickly managed to establish a one-party regime. It was easy for the voters of the Social Democratic Party. They almost all switched over to the National Socialist Party because the program was quite similar. Hitler's policy then was, I want to get rid of the Versailles Treaty, of the determinations that they made there. So first, he remilitarized the Rhineland, which had been demilitarized before. Then he took over Austria. Austria had been outlawed before from joining Germany, which the majority had wanted. And then he took over the Sudetenland, that is the German-speaking parts of the Czechs, of Czechoslovakia. Then he wanted some concessions from Poland in accordance more or less with the Wilsonian idea of self-determination, because there lived plenty of Germans who wanted to become part of Germany. He, after Poland turned out to be rather intransigent in this regard, encouraged by the fact that they had some treaty with England and France, Hitler invaded Poland, and upon that, war was declared against Germany by Britain and France. So this time we had only a very short period of peace. In 1939, World War II begins. Now remember, 100 years of peace after this monarchical peace treaty at the Vienna Congress, only 30 years after the vindictive punishment of Germany after World War I. Hitler's goal Hitler was rather Anglophile. He did not want any war with England, and the German blitzkrieg that started after Britain and France had declared war on Germany. The German blitzkrieg took only a few months, and France capitulated. Hitler was, at that time, thought that the whole thing would be over. He offered peace to England, even though there were plenty of British troops still on the continent. They didn't even pursue them, they let them escape. Even at that time, it would have been easy to also beat the British troops on the European continent. Hitler's goal was, of course, Russia, in accordance with what he had said, that he needed Lebensraum for the Aryan race. The war could have ended easily after the Blitzkrieg. That it didn't end was mainly the achievement of Churchill. Churchill had always been a warmonger already in the First World War, and Churchill was successful in persuading also Roosevelt to come to his rescue, and Roosevelt was eager to get into the Second World War, because he thought that would be a nice way of solving his unemployment problem that he had during the Great Depression in the United States. The lineup in the Second World War was, of course, similar to the First World War, but in a way it was a continuation of the First World War. Italy and Japan joined the Axis powers of Germany and Hungary and these places. And as far as the Allies were concerned, this was again United States, England, France, and interestingly now also the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was, at Churchill's urging, included in the Lend-Lease program that the Americans had offered to Britain in order for Britain to keep the war going. Lend-Lease program was basically the agreement that we would send you money and material with almost no guarantee that you would get anything in return. They included the Soviet Union in this Lend-Lease program, despite the fact that Churchill, and maybe to a lesser extent also Roosevelt, quite well knew what type of regime existed at the time in the Soviet Union. Interestingly, also the Soviet Union, of course, had also invaded Poland just a week later than the Germans had, but no war was declared against the Soviet Union, despite the fact that they had just done exactly the same thing that had led Britain and France to declare war against Germany, namely invading Poland. If we look now at the end of the war, as I said, that was the main purpose here, is to discuss the end of the wars. This time, the three people who decided how that war would end, by the way, there were 70 to 85 million dead at the end of the Second World War, mostly civilians. This time it was Roosevelt, and then after Roosevelt's death, Truman, Churchill, and Stalin. And they met, the most important meetings were held at Yalta and in Potsdam. What they decided, I should also mention that the Roosevelt administration was heavily infiltrated, for instance, by communists. Harry Hopkins was one of the most important advisors to Roosevelt, who was afterwards clearly identified as a communist, and Harry Dexter White, also a communist, playing a very important role in the Roosevelt administration. That explains to a certain extent the great sympathy that they had to the Soviet Union, despite the fact that that was the most murderous regime at that time. In Germany, maybe they had killed in peacetime a few thousand people. The number of people killed at that time in peacetime at the Soviet Union were about 20 million. So the result of this alliance that they made was that, as you know, that of course all of Central Europe fell for nearly 50 years or so under communist rule. So this is something that all Central Europe owes, in particular, to Churchill and Roosevelt. Again, the maps of Europe were completely redrawn as a result. The split between West and East came into existence. The eastern part of Central Europe and Eastern Europe all fell under communist control, and the western part, the West Bloc, came under control of England, France, and the United States, but ultimately, of course, as the most important country of the United States. Germany this time there were no peace negotiations offered at any time, so they insisted on unconditional surrender. A quarter of the territory, of the pre-war territory of Germany, was lost. 17 million Germans were expelled from places where they had lived for hundreds of years. 3 to 5 million of these people who had expelled from their former homes died as a result of having to flee them. The Russians, Germany was then split basically into two parts. One part occupied by the Soviets, and the other part occupied by the three Western powers. The Soviets took whatever was valuable and movable and transported it simply to the Soviet Union. The Americans, in particular, the other Western powers, they expropriated the Germans, took control over whatever was still standing, and had, for the first time, something that did not exist before in any of these peace treaties, war criminal trials. Again, after World War I, for instance, even though that some people had said the Kaiser should be hanged and the Sultan should be killed and all the rest of it, none of that actually happened. But after World War II, you had the first time a situation where you did not let bygones be bygones, but you insisted on punishment of people. The most famous one was the Nuremberg trial, where that, what I think was 17 people sentenced to death. And that Nuremberg trial was a kangaroo court. Even Senator Taft in the United States said at that time, this is a miscarriage of justice. It's unbelievable what sort of evidence was used. The main prosecutor of the Russians, for instance, was the same one who had led the accusations against the enemies of Stalin in Russia a few years before. The Americans, the Western powers, occupied now all of these territories. Remember, after World War I, there was no occupation of Germany taking place, except for a small part, for a small period of time by the French. The Americans actually withdrew their troops back to the United States. So Germany was not an occupied country, even though they had lost the war and lots of territory and so forth. After World War II, however, the winning sides never left. The Russians stayed in East Germany until 1990, and then they withdrew. The Americans stay until this day. There are troops in Germany at military bases, atomic weapons stationed in Germany. So America did not remove itself from Germany, all of Europe remained a place where you have American troops stationed to this very day. Britain and France became second-ranking powers, and the United States became the only dominant Western power. Now the Americans had, of course, a plan what to do with Germany. They didn't do anything after World War I. It was true. They left the Germans basically alone. But this time they had plans what to do with the Germans. So, and these plans were, first of all, Germany was supposed to be decentralized. That was easily done. The most important state in Germany was Prussia, and Prussia was considered to be the center of all German evil. So Prussia was simply dissolved, and a new arrangement of German states was created. Then the plan had been initially de-industrialization of Germany. The Morgenthau plan, for instance, thought that Germany should be turned into some sort of agricultural country with a peasant population. They realized quickly that that would not work, because you would expect that mass starvations would break out. If you would, a large population such as this could not be sustained if Germany would be completely de-industrialized and you had only some peasant country. Since they realized that they couldn't sell that at home, that there would be mass starvation of Germans, so they gave that up and did allow Germany to re-industrialize to a certain extent according to economic ideas that had been developed during the New Deal period in the United States. Then demilitarization. Demilitarization means the entire army and so forth all had to be dismissed. But again, there a quick adjustment was made because the Cold War broke out. And as the Cold War was heating up, so to speak, the Americans realized we have to also rearm the Germany, and ultimately it came to the rebuilding of a German army, and Germany joining, West Germany joining NATO, which indicated who was now boss in the world, in the Western world. The United States, as the head of NATO, Germany was allowed to join the Western Alliance. Then there was a program of denazification. So what did that mean? The denazification, you had about 8 million Nazi party members out of a population of 80 million. So, and most of these, most Germans were not party members, and even of these 8 million who were, most of them did that out of reasons of convenience. It helped you a little bit to get this job or that job. General Patton, for instance, who was against American war hero, was against this denazification program because he thought most of these Germans who had joined the Nazi party had no more, did that for the same reason that Republicans in the United States joined the Republican Party or joined the Democratic Party. After saying this sort of thing, General Patton was immediately dismissed. Now, the denazification meant that lots of people had to fill out some forms answering all sorts of questions. Some people were barred from doing certain occupations for some period, and they were categorized in different degrees of being criminal or being collaborators and so forth. After a while, some of them were allowed to re-enter public life because, again, you could make use even of old Nazis because they also had, during the Nazi period, they had, of course, made propaganda against the Russians. And now in the Cold War, these people were again useful. They were already experienced in doing anti-Russian propaganda, so they became again useful tools. And because they had some sort of slightly shaky passed, it was easy to control them, and you could almost be certain that they would toe the correct political line. Other parts of this re-education program was licensing. Every type of newspaper had to be licensed. Every publishing house had to be licensed. Every organization that somehow had an opinion molding power had to receive a license. The people who awarded these licenses or denied licenses were people who were following immediately the invading armies. There was an invading army of educators coming to Germany, and most of them, as the Roosevelt administration was a leftist type of administration, most of them were also lefties and gave, of course, licenses to people who sympathized with their lefty outlook. The entire education system was restructured. Every textbook had to be licensed so that the correct history would be told. Civics or Gemeinschaftskunde, that is, was a new field introduced into the German school curriculum, and political science, which had been a discipline of minor importance in the German system before. Political science became now a department that was installed in every university. Political science department was basically tasked with the job of turning out good Democrats. And interestingly, of these newly licensed people, and those people who were supposed to write the new textbooks and promote the new view of history, most of them were people who returned, were immigrants to the United States during the Nazi time, and now returned to Germany. And they, of course, were predominantly leftist Jewish people. And now I want to just say a few words about what type of people those were. And here I come to the Frankfurt School, which is, of course, famous school in Germany, because they were the main educators, the main re-educators in Germany, coming back to Germany and doing their job. So let me say a few interesting things, I think, about this Frankfurt School. That is people associated with the so-called Institute for Social Research. That was founded in 1923 by two German Jewish people, one Hermann Weil, who was a grain dealer and learned his trade in Germany, and was then sent by his future father-in-law to Argentina to continue his business in Argentina. Then he became independent. That is, he married the daughter of his teacher in Germany, and Hermann Weil became the biggest grain dealer in the world. He was, in current terms, he was a billionaire. He employed about 3,000 people and had 60 major ships. His son Felix Weil was born in Argentina. He still inherited as a teenager from his mother, who died early, a fortune of $400 million in current terms. The two Weils returned for health reasons in the early 1900s back to Germany to get health treatment. They conducted themselves as patriotic Germans at the beginning. Hermann Weil was a big donor to all sorts of civic causes, and Felix Weil actually wanted to serve in the German army, but was rejected because he was an Argentinian citizen and not a German citizen. He was quite disappointed about the fact that they didn't take him. So then when Germany, they were even invited by Kaiser Wilhelm to dine with them because of their generosity that they had shown. When Germany lost the war, Felix Weil was extremely disappointed, and he had expected that some sort of revolution would break out after that, and that didn't happen. So he turned to Marxism. He became an ardent Marxist and thought, despite the fact, by the way, that he came from an enormously wealthy family, he thought only the expropriation of the capitalists would prevent any disasters like this, like the First World War in the future. So both father and son then decided to establish an institute. Felix Weil went to school in Germany, got his PhD at the University of Frankfurt, and now assembled around himself a large contingent of Jewish leftist people. They were either members or sympathizers of the Communist Party or of the left wing of the Social Democratic Party. All of them were coming from wealthy families. None of them was as wealthy as the Weils were. But for instance, names that will come up later, Horkheimer and Marcuse and Pollock came from business families that had big businesses. So some similarity here between Marx and Engels. Marx came from well-off family, but of course he was poor as compared with Engels. So here you had the same sort of coalition. The super rich Weils assemble around themselves leftist, almost exclusively to the last man, leftist Jewish followers, hundreds of them. The institute that they founded was loosely associated with the University of Frankfurt. Loosely because there were opposition within the university to be associated with a bunch of leftist radicals. But the Weils immediately erected a building for the institute, and the institute offered then to the university that they could use part of their buildings, but they insisted that they should have some limited control over what was going on in this institute, and they came up with a solution that the director of the institute would at the same time have to be a regular professor also at the university and be accepted by the university as a regular professor. The first person that they chose for this purpose was Karl Grünberg. Karl Grünberg was the teacher of the so-called Austrian Marxists like Adler and Renner and so forth. He was already in his early 60s. He was an established lefty Marxist professor in Vienna, and he was the first one who got this double appointment, a chair at the University of Frankfurt, and at the other hand, the head of the Institute of Social Research. Interestingly, Karl Grünberg was also the dissertation advisor of Ludwig von Mises, before Mises turned to become an opponent of these lefty people. But this is some curious anecdote that there is, so to speak, some connection between Ludwig von Mises on the one hand and the Frankfurt School, even though it is a highly indirect connection. Grünberg had a stroke after a few years and retired, and then the next director became Max Horkheimer. Max Horkheimer was a theoretician, a philosopher, and he was the one who, in a way, created the image of the Frankfurt School. Grünberg had little influence on that. He was just an historian. And the direction that this institute took was they promoted some sort of non-orthodox Marxism combined with psychoanalysis. They all had been disappointed. Why was there no revolution taking place? That what all the lefties had expected after the war. That all the explanation is there must be a psychological explanation. There's something wrong with the people. We have to find out what that is. So they combined their Marxist teaching with psychoanalysis, and the person put in charge of this combination was Erich Fromm, also became a very famous person then in the United States later on. Once the National Socialists took over in Germany, all of them immediately lost their job because they were, after all, Jewish. And the institute moved away from Frankfurt. The building was taken over by the Nazis, but they were smart enough, especially the economic advisor of Max Horkheimer, Friedrich Pollock. All the funds of the Weils had been already transferred to foreign accounts. So they established, they moved to Geneva in 1933 and had some side branches in London, which only lasted for a few years, and also in Paris, which was closed then as soon as World War II broke out in 1939. In Geneva, they stayed only for a very short period of time. In 1934, they moved to the United States. They had established contacts with Columbia University and the New School of Social Research in the United States. They had, interestingly, if you compare this again with the life of Ludwig von Mises in the United States, they really lived it up in the United States because they had this huge endowment from the Weil family. For instance, in New York, Horkheimer, Adorno, Pollock, and Marcuse had not only an apartment in New York, they had a car and they had a maid. That was not exactly the standard of living that Ludwig von Mises was offered when he came to the United States. To indicate further how well they did there, Horkheimer in some sort of affidavit said that his salary at that time in current terms was more than $200,000 a year. In 1938, there was a split taking place between Horkheimer and Erich Fromm, and Erich Fromm got a separation payment of $400,000 in current terms. So you can roughly see these people were not tremendously struggling there economically. In 1941, so middle of the war, Horkheimer, Adorno, Pollock, and Marcuse decided we would make a second branch in the United States. In New York, we do the empirical work, and we will move to California. They lived in Pacific Palisades. In Pacific Palisades, they had then gatherings, for instance, with Bertolt Brecht and his circle. They had parties together with Charlie Chaplin, Aldous Huxley, Greta Garbo, and Ava Gardner. So you see, that was, I mean, a pretty good society, I would say, I mean, as far as the girls concerned. Ava Gardner was a pretty good-looking girl, I guess. Yeah. Then, of course, at the end of the war, the decision had to be made: what do we do now? Many of these people stayed in the United States. Some, Marcuse, for instance, stayed in the United States. Erich Fromm stayed in the United States. Otto Kirchheimer stayed in the United States. Franz Neumann stayed in the United States. They all had top jobs that they acquired. Some of them had already worked for the precursor of the CIA in order to just tell the Americans who the bad Germans were and what they had to do with them, and all the rest of it. So it's important to see that since 1934, the Frankfurt School exercised influence also in the United States. It is not a movement that existed only in Germany, but they were powerful intellectuals in the United States. Adorno, Horkheimer, and Pollock, the three main guys, they moved back to Germany. And they now had the job of re-educating the German population. In their empirical work, they had found out that the Germans suffered from an authoritarian personality. A book was written by Adorno and other authors about the authoritarian personality. And the authoritarian personality was some sort of caricature of an evil father who is bowing to the authority above and suppressing the people below, the wife being a housewife not interested in anything, and the kids being drilled all the time. It was like, it was not really, it was indeed a caricature of some obnoxious family, which they found that was very frequent and in Germany, and something had to be done about that. What had to be done about that was, of course, an anti-authoritarian education that had to go on. They had, recall that all these institutions had been licensed. They had, of course, very easy access now to all of these institutions, that radio, publishing houses, newspapers, and so forth, because after all, they came with the imprimatur of the Americans back to Germany. Horkheimer was appointed back to his chair that he had before. Adorno and Pollock were immediately promoted, first to extraordinary and then to ordinary professorships, and they could make demands. They were no longer dependent entirely on the Weil Foundation, but now they were also able to just go for public funding from the New Germany. What the effect of this Reeducation program was, this was what we call these anti-authoritarian personality has to be created. So they did not really know exactly how to create that. I mean, they were good at describing what the authoritarian family looked like, but what to do about it, that was not all that clear. What that amounted to, in a way, was that any type of hierarchy had to be attacked. There was an attack on family hierarchy. They promoted feminism. They promoted sexual liberation and anti-nationalism. The result of this anti-authoritarian program came to a certain extent as a surprise to Adorno and Horkheimer themselves, because they were personally, culturally conservative types. So all of a sudden they were confronted, for instance, with the Institute of Social Research that was rebuilt immediately after World War II, that the Institute of Social was occupied by students. So Adorno and Horkheimer couldn't believe that would happen, even though that was in a way what their program had been. Adorno's lectures at that time, I studied in Frankfurt, I saw that with my own eyes. So the sexual liberation, the result of that was that bare-breasted women were entering the lecturing podium of Adorno and embarrassing him. And Adorno was helpless. I mean, he could have. Some people can handle these sorts of things very easily, but he couldn't believe his own eyes that he saw that bare-breasted women hanging out there and disturbing his lectures. And of course, they had become Americans. They disliked the fact that in this new left that they created in Germany, there were also anti-American sentiments coming up. But they didn't want any of that. So you had to be strictly against the East Bloc. That was their view. And all people who were suspected of being too friendly towards the East Germany or too friendly towards the Soviet Union were eliminated from the Institute of Social Research. Then in the following, the civil rights movement swept to Germany. The civil rights movement in the United States had been promoted by the American branch of the Frankfurt School. Remember, those who stayed in the United States. They had played a great role in creating the student rebellion that started in the United States and then spread also to Europe. So affirmative action became something that became all of a sudden also important in Germany. Then any hierarchies were considered to be not normal phenomena, but the result of oppression. And that, the ultimate result of that, you all know, that is anybody except white heterosexual males, especially if they were married and children, those were the only privileged class, and everybody else was underprivileged and had to be helped out. Again, I'm not saying that Horkheimer and Adorno all anticipated this sort of thing and had that exactly in mind, but this was what was the result of what they had initiated. In general, the leftward shift in Germany was further promoted by their influence. And you had then, up to this day, you can say the welfare state is a taboo. There's no question that the welfare state is the greatest thing ever invented. How big that should be, there could be a little bit of discussion about it, but no question, welfare state was it. Then there had to be unconditional support for the US, and there had to be unconditional support for Israel. That was what they preached from the very beginning. And this is indeed what characterizes the German situation currently. The welfare state is continuously growing. The US is, whatever the US does, currently in Ukraine or whatever it is, Germany must help and pay. Whatever Israel does, Germany must accept it and pay. All attempts, for instance, or we also have even the countries like, even the party like the Greens were originally like peaceniks, turned in the meantime into the most belligerent party that exists in Germany. I also learned in the transformation of the Greens to become a belligerent party that women can sometimes be worse warmongers than men can be. The Greens, the great leadership, many women involved in this, also in other parties, they are the ones that are most eager to engage in war, more so than in other parties. So the transformation, you could say, is almost complete, except one problem has emerged, and that is this problem of mass migration, mass invasion of foreigners of Europe. As a result, mostly of American military maneuvers in the Middle East and in Africa and so forth, all of a sudden, millions of foreigners came to Europe, and especially to Germany as the most generous welfare state. And the German elites, having been trained by the Frankfurt School, welcomed them and gave them handouts. They were all put on the dole. And if you put them all on the dole, then you can, of course, expect more and more people will coming. So the indigenous population is gradually dispossessed and replaced by alien cultures that all of a sudden appear in these places, in Germany, not only Germany, all over Western Europe in the meantime. The only opposition came from, was the strongest opposition against this tendency of Germany being taken over, was coming from people from the East German provinces, that is, those parts of Germany that originally had been occupied by the Russians. The Russians had a very different way of re-educating the population than the Americans and the British had in the West. Their re-education was brutal, but it was superficial. It didn't go deep. Most of the people just didn't believe in that crap that they said. Of course, they sang the International and all the rest of it, but they were not international socialists. They thought this welfare that they were giving to the foreigners, that was incorrect. They should get it. After all, they were Germans and they were foreigners, and why don't we get this sort of thing? So what you see here again is a national socialism when it comes to competition between international socialism and national socialism is always more popular. But the leading parties in Germany, the power elite, are the ones, and we have in Germany one nationalist party, that's called the Alternative für Deutschland, AfD. All other parties are internationalists. The AfD is the only nationalist party. They accept all the rest of that just like everybody else. That is, they are also in favor of the welfare state. They're also in favor of the European Union. They're also in favor of everything else. The only difference is they think the welfare state should be mostly for Germans and not for foreigners. And they are now combated to the hilt by the ruling elites. Even the ruling elites trying to outlaw this party and bringing them to heel. The AfD is the only party that is less belligerent than all other parties. And the elite currently wants even more eagerly than the United States to conduct this war in Ukraine, spend inordinate amount of money on the Ukraine, and wants to rearm Germany. And the motto is now, unless we Germans become kriegstüchtig again, the war prepared, the Russians are coming, the Russians are coming. So that is the current situation. The Germans are now becoming kriegstüchtig again. That is warlike, because otherwise the Russians, that recall, the Russians withdrew in 1990-91 their troops from East Germany while the Americans stayed. But now what the elites tell us, unless we help Ukraine until the last Ukrainian person dies there in that war, the Russians will be in Berlin again, and we have to prevent that by all means. Rearmament, reintroducing the military draft, and so is the only thing that we should do. With that, thank you again. As I said, you can read a very elaborate version of all of this in the on my website, and find many more interesting details there than I was able to present here in a slightly rambling fashion. Thank you so much. And